In the first weeks of January 1945, the islands of the Philippines stood once more at the center of world attention. General Douglas MacArthur had kept his promise. American forces stormed ashore at Lingayen Gulf on the 9th of January, bringing with them the thunder of liberation. Across Luzon, Filipino civilians wept with joy. Church bells rang. Children waved makeshift American flags fashioned from scraps of cloth hidden for 3 long years. But inside the prison camp at Cabanatuan, located some 30 miles behind Japanese lines in the central plains of Nueva Ecija province, the 500 American and Allied prisoners felt something far more complicated than hope. They heard the distant rumble of artillery. They watched their guards grow increasingly nervous, and they understood with terrible clarity that liberation, if it came too slowly, might never come at all. The men of Cabanatuan had learned to recognize the signs of desperation in their captors. Orders barked more harshly. Patrols conducted with greater frequency. Whispered conversations among guards that stopped abruptly when prisoners drew near. These were not the behaviors of men preparing to surrender their charges peacefully. These were the actions of soldiers contemplating something far darker. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Intelligence reaching American commanders confirmed the prisoners' worst fears. Japanese military doctrine had evolved a grim policy as defeat loomed across the Pacific. Rather than allow prisoners to be liberated and returned to Allied hands, commanders received authorization to eliminate them. The language in official communications remained bureaucratic, even sterile, but the meaning was unmistakable. Captives represented a liability that could be erased. The massacre at Palawan had proven this was no idle threat. On December 14, 1944, as American forces advanced toward that island, Japanese guards herded nearly 150 prisoners into covered trenches at Puerto Princesa. Without warning, soldiers poured gasoline into the shelters and set them ablaze. Those who tried to escape the flames were machine-gunned or bayoneted. Only 11 men survived to tell the story, bearing burns and wounds that testified to the horror. Word of Palawan spread quickly through intelligence networks and reached the prisoners at Cabanatuan through the dangerous but persistent grapevine of Filipino civilians who risked death to pass information. The men behind the wire needed no elaboration. They understood perfectly what awaited them if American forces arrived too late or if Japanese commanders decided that evacuation was impossible. These were not ordinary prisoners. They were survivors of the earliest and darkest days of the Pacific War. Most had fought at Bataan, holding out for months against impossible odds after the Japanese invasion in December 1941. Others had defended Corregidor Island until its surrender in May 1942. They had endured the Bataan Death March, where thousands perished from exhaustion, starvation, and deliberate brutality. They had survived 3 years of disease, malnutrition, and systematic cruelty that had already killed tens of thousands of their comrades. Out of more than 75,000 men who surrendered in 1942, only about 500 remained at Cabanatuan by January 1945. The rest had died, been shipped to labor camps in Japan and elsewhere, or succumbed to the grinding attrition of captivity. These survivors represented the toughest, the luckiest, or perhaps simply those whom fate had not yet claimed. Many were sick, nearly all were gaunt shadows of the soldiers they had once been, but their memories remained sharp, and their will to survive had carried them through 3 years of hell. Now, as the sounds of war drew closer with each passing day, they faced a cruel paradox. The liberation they had dreamed of for so long might be the very thing that sealed their doom. Japanese commanders knew that freeing these men would provide the Americans with powerful propaganda and first-hand accounts of atrocities. Better, from Tokyo's perspective, to ensure they never spoke at all. American planners at MacArthur's headquarters understood the arithmetic of this nightmare. Every day the Sixth Army pushed deeper into Luzon, brought them closer to Cabanatuan. But every day also increased the likelihood that garrison commanders would act on their orders. Time was not an ally. It was an enemy as deadly as any Japanese division. The mission that emerged from these calculations was as audacious as it was desperate. A force would have to penetrate 30 miles behind enemy lines, strike a heavily guarded camp with precision and speed, and extract more than 500 prisoners through Japanese-held territory before reinforcements could respond. Failure would mean not just the deaths of the raiders, but the certain execution of every man they had come to save. The deadliest promise of liberation hung over Cabanatuan like a storm about to break, and somewhere in the American lines, plans were already taking shape for one of the most daring rescue missions in military history. The prisoners at Cabanatuan were not statistics. They were men with names, histories, and stories that stretched back to the darkest hours of American defeat in the Pacific. They were the survivors of Bataan and Corregidor, places that had become synonymous with sacrifice and suffering. And by January 1945, they carried within them the accumulated weight of 3 years that had broken lesser men completely. Most had been soldiers or airmen when the Japanese invaded the Philippines in December 1941, just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. They had fought a desperate defensive campaign across Luzon, watching their supplies dwindle and their hopes for reinforcement fade. By April 1942, starvation and disease had reduced the American and Filipino forces on Bataan to shadows. When surrender finally came, it marked only the beginning of their ordeal. The Bataan Death March remained seared into every survivor's memory. Nearly 76,000 men, American and Filipino, were forced to march more than 60 miles in blistering tropical heat. Japanese guards denied them food, water, and rest. Those who fell were bayoneted or shot. Those who stopped to help the fallen were killed alongside them. Thousands died on the roads. The exact number would never be known with certainty, but witnesses later estimated that as many as 10,000 perished during that march alone. Those who survived the march arrived at prison camps like Cabanatuan already weakened beyond recognition. Here, suffering took different but equally devastating forms. Malaria swept through the barracks in waves, leaving men shaking with fever and delirium. Dysentery caused agonizing dehydration and death. Beriberi, resulting from vitamin deficiency, caused bodies to swell grotesquely or nervous systems to fail. Medical supplies were virtually non-existent. American doctors, themselves prisoners, performed surgeries with improvised instruments and treated infections with crushed aspirin tablets when they could obtain them at all. The Japanese guards enforced their authority with casual violence. Men were beaten for minor infractions, or sometimes for no reason beyond a guard's bad mood. Food rations were deliberately kept below subsistence levels. A typical daily meal might consist of a handful of rice, perhaps supplemented with watery soup or occasional vegetables. Protein was rare. Prisoners watched their own bodies consume themselves, muscle wasting away as starvation progressed. From the tens of thousands who passed through Cabanatuan's gates, the population steadily declined. Some died. Others were transferred to Japan or other locations for slave labor in mines, shipyards, and factories. By late 1944, as the tide of war turned against Japan, the camp held only about 500 men. These were often the sickest, those deemed too weak for transport, or simply those who had been overlooked in the chaos of a collapsing empire. Yet, despite everything, the prisoners maintained fragments of dignity and resistance. They built hidden radios from scavenged parts, desperate for news of the outside world. When broadcasts reported Allied victories, the information spread through whispered conversations that guards could not intercept. Officers organized secret classes, teaching mathematics, history, and languages to younger soldiers. These lessons served no practical purpose in a death camp, but they represented defiance of a different kind, an assertion that minds could remain free even when bodies were caged. They held makeshift religious services, drawing strength from faith when physical strength had long since failed. They carved names into wood or scratched them into walls, determined that their existence would leave some mark, some proof they had lived. They formed bonds of friendship that sustained morale when hope seemed absurd. A man who received an extra portion of rice might share it with a sicker comrade, even knowing that generosity might cost him his own life. By late 1944, a new sound began to reach the camp. Artillery fire, distant but unmistakable. The deep rumble of explosions. Occasionally, the drone of aircraft overhead. The prisoners knew what these sounds meant. MacArthur was returning. The promise he had made when evacuating the Philippines in 1942 was being fulfilled. American forces were coming back. This knowledge created an almost unbearable tension. Liberation felt tantalizingly close. Yet each day brought new dangers. Guards grew more erratic. Orders changed frequently. The routine brutality of camp life took on an edge of panic. And then came the whispers about Palawan, about prisoners burned alive as American troops approached. The men of Cabanatuan understood their situation perfectly. They were witnesses to Japanese atrocities. They were evidence of war crimes. And they were trapped in a camp that might at any moment become their grave. So they waited, listening to the artillery grow louder, watching their guards with fearful attention, and clinging to a hope that battled constantly with dread. They had survived 3 years of hell. They had endured diseases that killed thousands. They had watched friends die and had somehow continued living. Now, at the moment when rescue seemed possible, death had never felt closer. The cruel arithmetic was simple. Either American forces would reach them in time, or Japanese orders would be carried out. There was no middle ground. And, with each passing day in January 1945, the balance tipped further toward catastrophe. Behind the wire at Cabanatuan, 500 men lived in the shadow of liberation, knowing it might be the last shadow they would ever see. The responsibility for rescuing the prisoners at Cabanatuan fell to Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci and his 6th Ranger Battalion, a unit forged for exactly this kind of mission. These were not ordinary infantry. They had trained for raids deep behind enemy lines, for lightning strikes that required both surgical precision and overwhelming violence. Mucci himself was a commander who understood that audacity, when properly calculated, could achieve what caution never would. But Mucci also understood his limitations. His battalion numbered barely 120 men. They faced a garrison of at least 200 Japanese soldiers, possibly more, situated 30 miles beyond American lines. The camp itself sat near Cabanatuan City, where additional enemy forces could respond within minutes. Worse, the mission's success depended not just on breaching the camp, but on extracting more than 500 prisoners, many too weak to walk, across miles of hostile territory before Japanese reinforcements could organize a pursuit. No single unit could accomplish this alone. What emerged from planning sessions at 6th Army headquarters was something unprecedented. A coalition operation that would require perfect coordination between American Special Forces, elite scouts, and Filipino resistance fighters who had been waging guerrilla war for 3 years. The Alamo Scouts represented the intelligence cornerstone of the operation. This reconnaissance unit had earned a reputation across the Pacific for their ability to infiltrate Japanese positions, gather precise information, and vanish without detection. In the days before the raid, scout teams crept to within sight of Cabanatuan, concealing themselves in vegetation and observing every detail of camp routine. They counted guards, noted patrol schedules, mapped machine gun positions, and identified the weakest points in the camp's perimeter. Their reports would determine whether the raid was feasible at all. Equally crucial were the Filipino guerrilla networks commanded by Captain Juan Pajota and Captain Eduardo Joson. These men had never surrendered when the Philippines fell in 1942. Instead, they had melted into the countryside and built resistance organizations that harassed Japanese forces through ambushes, intelligence gathering, and sabotage. By 1945, Pajota commanded several hundred fighters in Nueva Ecija province. Joson led comparable forces nearby. Both knew every trail, every village, every Japanese position in the region. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Without the guerrillas, the mission was suicide. Japanese units moved along roads that rangers would need to cross. Reinforcements from Cabanatuan city could reach the camp within an hour. Troops stationed near the Kabu River could block any escape route. Pajota and Joseon would have to position their forces to intercept these threats, buying time for the rangers to breach the camp and begin the extraction. It would require them to fight delaying actions against numerically superior forces, potentially sacrificing themselves so the prisoners could escape. Captain Robert Prince, Muchi's executive officer, would lead the actual assault on the camp. Planning sessions revealed the complexity of the challenge. The compound was surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Japanese soldiers maintained watch around the clock. Any frontal assault would alert the garrison before rangers could penetrate the perimeter, giving guards time to execute prisoners or organize a defense that would turn the raid into a bloodbath. The solution came from an unexpected source. Intelligence officers learned that a P-61 Black Widow night fighter would be operating in the area. These twin-engine aircraft, designed for nocturnal missions, could provide a critical diversion. At precisely 7 o'clock in the evening, the plane would perform a low-altitude flyover of the camp, cutting its engines dramatically before reigniting them. The spectacle would draw Japanese attention skyward at the exact moment rangers began their approach. Timing would be everything. Guerrilla forces had to be in blocking positions before the assault began. The aircraft diversion had to occur at the precise moment when rangers reached the camp perimeter. The assault itself needed to be violent enough to overwhelm defenders before they could react, yet controlled enough to avoid hitting prisoners in the chaos. And the extraction had to begin immediately, because every minute after the first shot was fired brought Japanese reinforcements closer. The coalition extended beyond military forces. Filipino civilians in villages near Cabanatuan were approached quietly by guerrilla leaders. Would they provide food for the column? Could they supply carabao carts to carry prisoners too weak to walk? Would they guide rangers along hidden paths through rice paddies? The requests were dangerous. Japanese retaliation against villages suspected of aiding Americans was swift and brutal. Entire communities could be burned, civilians executed as examples. Yet village after village agreed to help. In the final planning sessions, the arithmetic of the mission became clear. Success required perfect coordination between forces that had never trained together, across terrain unfamiliar to the rangers, against an enemy that outnumbered them and controlled all approach routes. The margin for error was zero. If the diversion failed, if guerrillas couldn't hold blocking positions, if the assault took too long, if carts didn't arrive, if guides lost their way, then the rangers would be trapped deep behind enemy lines with hundreds of prisoners who couldn't defend themselves. Muchi understood these odds when he addressed his battalion on January 27, 1945. He made no attempt to minimize the danger. He told them exactly what they faced, exactly what could go wrong, exactly how many ways they might die. Then he gave them a choice. Any man who felt the mission was too risky could withdraw without prejudice. Not a single ranger stepped back. The decision was made, the coalition was assembled, the plan was as solid as desperate circumstances allowed, and the clock was ticking. Intelligence suggested Japanese commanders were growing increasingly nervous about the camp's proximity to American lines. Orders for evacuation or elimination could arrive at any moment. The raid would go forward on January 30th, 1945. Either they would pull off one of the most daring rescues in military history, or they would condemn both rescuers and prisoners to death behind enemy lines. There was no middle ground, no safety net, no backup plan. Only audacity remained. On the evening of January 28, 1945, the 6th Ranger Battalion began their march toward Cabanatuan. The journey would cover nearly 30 miles through territory controlled by Japanese forces. Every step took them deeper into danger, farther from American lines, closer to a camp where 500 men waited unknowingly for salvation that might never arrive. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci led his rangers out of the American perimeter just after dusk. Darkness provided concealment, but it also complicated navigation through unfamiliar terrain. The men moved in single file, each soldier keeping the man ahead barely visible in the gloom. They carried light packs to maintain speed, but even stripped-down equipment felt heavy as the miles accumulated. Rifles, ammunition, grenades, medical supplies, rations. For several days, the minimum loadout for a raid this deep behind enemy lines. Filipino guerrilla guides met them at predetermined points, materializing from shadows to lead the column along paths invisible to American eyes. These routes avoided main roads where Japanese patrols moved with regularity. Instead, the guides led rangers through rice paddies where water sucked at boots with each step, along narrow dikes barely wide enough for single file, through groves of bamboo that rustled with every movement and seemed to amplify sound in the darkness. The first close call came within hours of departure. Rangers had just entered a rice paddy when scouts ahead signaled frantically for the column to halt and take cover. Distant engine noise grew rapidly louder. Headlights appeared on a road running parallel to their position, perhaps 200 yards away. A Japanese convoy, trucks filled with soldiers, rumbled past. The Rangers pressed themselves into the mud, faces down, hoping darkness and distance would hide them. Troops in the trucks were singing, their voices carrying across the night. The convoy passed without slowing, but the incident reminded everyone how precarious their situation was. They were surrounded by enemy forces, and discovery meant annihilation. Villages presented both opportunity and risk. Filipino civilians, warned in advance by guerrilla networks, provided crucial support despite knowing the consequences if Japanese discovered their assistance. In one hamlet, women emerged from homes carrying baskets of rice balls and fruit. They pressed food into rangers' hands, whispering blessings and prayers. In another village, farmers brought out their carabao carts, the wooden wagons pulled by water buffalo that would be essential for transporting prisoners during the escape. These carts were hidden near the camp, positioned for rapid deployment once the raid succeeded. The generosity was humbling. These civilians had lived under Japanese occupation for 3 years. They had seen neighbors executed for minor infractions or suspected resistance activity. They knew that helping American soldiers could bring devastating retaliation. Yet they chose to act anyway, driven by hatred of their occupiers and hope that liberation was finally at hand. Rangers moved through these villages quickly, minimizing the time that exposed civilians to risk, but the encounters left deep impressions. This was not just an American mission anymore. It was a shared struggle. The Pampanga River presented a significant obstacle on the night of January 29th. The current ran swift and cold, swollen from recent rains. Rangers had to cross in darkness, weapons and ammunition held above their heads to keep them dry. The water reached chest-deep in places, pulling at legs and threatening to sweep men downstream. Whispered curses mixed with the sound of splashing as soldiers struggled across. On the far bank, men stood shivering in wet uniforms, but no one suggested stopping to build fires. Smoke would betray their position, and they were still miles from their objective. Fatigue became a constant companion. By the morning of January 30th, many rangers had been awake and moving for more than 30 hours. Boots raised blisters, shoulders ached from pack straps, legs cramped from endless walking through uneven terrain, yet the pace never slackened. Mucci drove them forward, knowing that every hour of delay increased the danger to the prisoners they were coming to save. Filipino guerrilla units shadowed the column along parallel routes, providing a security screen that proved invaluable repeatedly. On several occasions, guerrilla scouts spotted Japanese patrols moving on intersecting paths and redirected the rangers to avoid contact. These men knew the rhythms of enemy movement, where patrols went at specific times, which roads were heavily traveled, and which lay quiet. Their expertise transformed what could have been a series of firefights into a ghostly passage through occupied territory. Captain Juan Pajota's forces were already moving toward their blocking positions near the Cabu River Bridge. His mission was perhaps even more dangerous than the Rangers. Once the assault began, Japanese reinforcements would rush from Cabanatuan City and other nearby garrisons. Pajota's guerrillas would have to hold these forces back long enough for prisoners to be evacuated, fighting a delaying action against troops with superior weapons and numbers. It was a mission with a high probability of casualties, but Pajota never hesitated. He had been fighting Japanese occupiers for 3 years. This was the moment he had been preparing for. By late afternoon on January 30th, the Rangers reached their final staging area, a concealed position about a mile from the camp. They had covered 30 miles through enemy territory without being detected, a testament to both their skill and the effectiveness of their Daku, Filipino guides. Now came the hardest part, waiting. The assault was scheduled for 7 o'clock that evening, timed to coincide with the P-61 Black Widow's diversion. Until then, the Rangers had to remain hidden in tall grass and bamboo thickets, watching the camp through binoculars, reviewing assignments one final time. Alamo scouts joined them with last-minute intelligence updates. Guard positions hadn't changed significantly. Prisoner barracks were where reconnaissance had indicated. The garrison appeared to be at normal strength, not reinforced. But the scouts also noted increased nervousness among Japanese soldiers, more frequent patrols, and discussions they couldn't fully overhear, but that suggested tension about the approaching American forces. Time seemed to slow as evening approached. Rangers checked weapons, redistributed ammunition, and mentally rehearsed their roles in the coming assault. They could see the camp now, watchtowers visible above the vegetation, occasional glimpses of guards moving along the perimeter. Somewhere behind that wire were 500 men who had suffered for 3 years, men who would die if this raid failed, men who had no idea that rescue was hours away. The sun dropped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Mucci checked his watch repeatedly. 7 o'clock approached, and with it came the moment when everything they had planned, everything they had marched through the night to accomplish, would be tested against the brutal reality of combat 30 miles behind enemy lines. Night fell on January 30th, 1945, and with it came the moment that would determine whether 500 prisoners lived or died. The Rangers lay concealed in tall grass, approximately 1 mile from the Cabanatuan camp, weapons ready, nerves stretched tight. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci checked his watch as the hands crept towards 7 o'clock in the evening. Everything depended on timing. The diversion had to work. The assault had to be overwhelming, and it all had to happen in the narrow window before Japanese forces could react. At precisely 7 o'clock, the sound of aircraft engines broke the evening silence. The P-61 Black Widow night fighter appeared over the camp, flying lower than regulations would normally permit. Captain Kenneth Schreiber, the pilot, executed the maneuver they had rehearsed. He cut the engines. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the whistle of wind across the aircraft's surfaces as it glided overhead. Japanese guards in the watchtowers looked up, alarmed, tracking what appeared to be a plane in distress about to crash directly into their position. Then Schreiber reignited the engines. The twin motors roared back to life with a thunderous burst that echoed across the rice fields. The Black Widow climbed sharply, engines screaming, then banked and came around for another pass. Guards throughout the camp stood transfixed, watching the aerial display. Some pointed and shouted, others grabbed binoculars. Officers emerged from buildings to observe the strange behavior of the American aircraft. For critical seconds, every eye in the garrison was focused skyward. Those seconds were all the Rangers needed. During the diversion, Captain Robert Prince led the main assault force forward, crawling on their stomachs through the final stretch of open ground. 120 men moved with practiced stealth, using every dip in the terrain, every shadow, every moment when Japanese attention remained locked on the circling aircraft. The distance closed. 50 yards, 30, 20. Rangers positioned themselves along the fence line, spread to cover multiple entry points, waiting for the signal. Mucci gave the order with a sharp hand gesture visible in the darkness. Explosions ripped through the night as grenades detonated against guard towers and machine gun positions. Bangalore torpedoes blew gaps in the barbed wire fence. Before the sound of the first blasts had faded, concentrated rifle fire tore into Japanese defensive positions. The Rangers had trained for this, rehearsed it, understood that overwhelming violence in the first seconds would determine whether they achieved surprise or walked into a prolonged firefight. The Japanese garrison, still recovering from confusion over the aircraft, found themselves under attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Guard towers erupted in flames. Machine gun nests that might have cut down advancing Rangers were destroyed before crews could bring weapons to bear. Soldiers stumbling from barracks into the chaos were met with precise fire from Rangers who had spent the last hour studying every structure, every path, every potential defensive position through binoculars. It was not a fair fight. The Rangers had surprise, coordination, and the advantage of men who knew exactly what they had to do. The Japanese, caught between the distraction overhead and the assault around them, struggled to organize a coherent defense. Some fought back from whatever cover they could find, firing blindly into darkness at muzzle flashes. Others attempted to reach weapons stored in barracks and were cut down in the open. A few tried to reach prisoner compounds, perhaps to carry out standing orders for execution, but Rangers moved faster, breaching the perimeter and establishing control before guards could act on those deadly instructions. Captain Prince's teams moved through the camp with terrifying efficiency. Each squad had specific objectives. One group secured the main gate. Another cleared guard barracks, throwing grenades into rooms before entering. A third team raced toward prisoner compounds, shouting to identify themselves as Americans to avoid being shot by confused POWs who might have acquired weapons. Bangalore torpedoes and wire cutters opened multiple escape routes through the fences, ensuring that if one path was blocked, others remained available. The ferocity of the assault overwhelmed Japanese defenders. Within minutes, organized resistance collapsed. Guards who survived the initial onslaught either fled into the darkness or died fighting from isolated positions. The machine guns that might have turned the tide sat silent, their crews killed in the opening seconds. Communication lines were cut. Officers attempting to rally their men became priority targets for Ranger marksmen who had been trained to identify and eliminate leadership quickly. Yet even amid the controlled chaos, discipline held. Rangers didn't pursue fleeing enemies beyond the immediate perimeter. Their mission was rescue, not annihilation. Every moment spent chasing scattered Japanese soldiers was a moment not spent extracting prisoners. Prince kept his teams focused on the objective, pulling back men who showed signs of letting adrenaline override training. The entire assault, from first explosion to secured perimeter, took approximately 30 minutes. In that half hour, the garrison at Cabanatuan was destroyed as an effective fighting force. More than 200 Japanese soldiers lay dead. Defensive positions were overrun. The camp, which had held 500 prisoners in brutal captivity for 3 years, was now in American hands. But the Rangers had suffered casualties too. 2 men were dead, killed in the fierce exchange of fire during the initial assault. 4 others were wounded, some seriously enough that they would need to be carried during the escape. These losses weighed heavily on Mucci and Prince, but there was no time to grieve. The sound of gunfire would carry for miles. Japanese units throughout the region now knew something catastrophic had occurred at Cabanatuan. Reinforcements would be mobilizing. The clock was ticking. Inside the prisoner barracks, 500 men were about to learn that the impossible had happened. Rangers began moving through compounds, kicking open doors, and shouting words that would change everything. The rescue was only beginning. Getting out alive would be the true test. Inside the prisoner barracks at Cabanatuan, the sound of explosions and gunfire triggered a terror that 3 years of captivity had burned into every man's consciousness. This was the moment they had feared. The massacre had begun. Japanese guards were going to kill them all rather than let them be liberated. Some prisoners threw themselves to the floor, seeking any protection against bullets they expected to tear through walls at any second. Others simply froze, paralyzed by the certainty that death had finally arrived. Then the doors burst open, but instead of Japanese guards with bayonets, American soldiers in combat gear rushed in, shouting in English, waving their arms, their faces urgent but not hostile. The words they yelled seemed impossible, a hallucination born of malnutrition and desperate hope. "We're Americans. You're free. Come on, we've got to get you out of here." Confusion dominated the first moments. Prisoners stared at the Rangers with expressions mixing disbelief, shock, and fear that this was some cruel trick. Many were too weak to stand quickly. 3 years of starvation had wasted muscles to the point where even sitting up required effort. Disease had left some partially blind, others with coordination so poor they couldn't walk straight. A few thought they were dreaming or hallucinating from fever. Rangers moved through the barracks, repeating the message, trying to overcome the paralyzing disbelief. "We're taking you home. You're going back to your families. But we need to move now." Some grabbed prisoners by the arms, gently but firmly helping them to their feet. The physical contact seemed to break through shock better than words. These were real soldiers, solid and present, not phantoms. This was actually happening. One prisoner, a sergeant who had survived the Bataan death march and 3 years at Cabanatuan, began to weep uncontrollably. Others joined him. Tears streamed down gaunt faces as the reality penetrated. They were being rescued. Someone had come for them. After 3 years of being forgotten, written off as dead or beyond help, American soldiers had risked their lives to bring them out. But emotion had to wait. The Rangers were insistent, almost rough in their urgency. "We don't have time. Japanese reinforcements are coming. You need to move right now." Those who could walk began stumbling toward the doors. Those who couldn't were simply lifted and carried. Rangers threw emaciated prisoners over their shoulders in firemen's carries, surprised at how little they weighed. Bodies that should have massed 170 or 180 pounds felt closer to 90 or 100. It was like carrying children. Some prisoners collapsed as soon as they tried to stand. Legs that had barely functioned for months couldn't support even their minimal weight. Rangers caught them before. They hit the ground and passed them to other soldiers, forming human chains to move men out of the barracks toward the breached fences. Every ranger had mentally prepared to carry prisoners, but the sheer number who couldn't walk under their own power was sobering. Outside the wire, the Filipino guerrilla forces were fighting the battle that would determine whether the rescue succeeded or failed. Captain Juan Pajota's fighters had positioned themselves near the Cabu River Bridge, the primary route Japanese reinforcements would use to reach the camp from Cabanatuan City. When the assault began, Pajota's men heard the explosions and knew their moment had come. Japanese forces responded exactly as expected. Within minutes of the first shots, trucks filled with soldiers began racing toward the bridge. Pajota let them come, waiting until the lead vehicles were committed to the span before opening fire. Machine guns raked the convoy from concealed positions. Explosives detonated on the lift, bridge itself, destroying sections, and sending one truck plunging into the river below. Japanese soldiers who survived the initial ambush found themselves pinned down by sustained fire from guerrillas, who knew every inch of the surrounding terrain. The battle at the Cabu River Bridge would rage for hours. Pajota's men faced repeated attempts by Japanese forces to break through their positions. They were outnumbered and outgunned, facing professional soldiers with artillery and armoured support against their collection of rifles, homemade explosives, and sheer determination. But they held. Every minute they kept Japanese reinforcements away from Cabanatuan was another minute for Rangers to extract prisoners and begin the escape. Captain Eduardo Joson's fighters engaged enemy forces approaching from different directions, setting up ambushes along roads that led to the camp. These guerrillas had been harassing Japanese patrols for 3 years. Now they fought with everything they had, knowing that hundreds of American prisoners' lives depended on their success. Like Pajota's men, they accepted casualties, maintained their positions, and bought time with their courage. Back at the camp, the prisoner evacuation continued with desperate urgency. Rangers had organized assembly points where men were being counted and organized into groups. Filipino civilians arrived with carabao carts, the wooden wagons pulled by water buffalo that moved with agonizing slowness but provided the only way to transport prisoners too sick or weak to walk. The weakest prisoners were loaded into carts, lying on wooden beds or sitting propped against sides. Captain Robert Prince moved through the chaos, maintaining order and timing. Every prisoner had to be accounted for. The Rangers couldn't leave anyone behind. Medics performed rapid triage, identifying those who needed immediate attention and those who could be moved safely. Time pressed against them relentlessly. The gunfire from guerrilla positions indicated that Japanese forces were actively trying to reach the camp. The window for escape was closing. 30 minutes after the assault began, Rangers had secured all prisoners and begun moving toward the escape route. The path they would take avoided main roads, relying instead on trails through rice paddies and vegetation that Filipino guides knew intimately. It would be slow, exhausting, and dangerous. But it was the only way to move more than 500 men through territory where Japanese forces were now fully alerted and searching for them. The raid itself was over. More than 200 Japanese soldiers lay dead among the ruins of their garrison. 2 Rangers had been killed in the assault, their bodies recovered and carried by their comrades who refused to leave them behind. 4 more Rangers had been wounded, adding to the burden of the column. But 513 prisoners were free. Americans who had been written off as lost were being led toward safety by men who had gambled everything on this audacious mission. The hardest part of the night still lay ahead. Getting into the camp had required stealth and violence. Getting out would require endurance, coordination, and more luck than anyone wanted to rely on. In the darkness of January 30th, 1945, a desperate column began its race against time and enemy forces through the heart of occupied Luzon. The column of Rangers and prisoners moved through the night of January 30th like a wounded serpent, slow and vulnerable. Filipino villagers brought carabao carts for men too weak to walk, while women pressed rice balls and coconuts into trembling hands. The weakest prisoners lay in wooden wagons that creaked alarmingly with every rotation of the wheels. One groaning axle threatened to betray their position to Japanese patrols searching the darkness. Behind them, Captain Juan Pajota's guerrillas fought desperately at the Cabu River Bridge, repelling repeated Japanese attempts to break through. The sound of that battle echoed across the rice fields, a constant reminder that enemy forces were hunting them. Aircraft passed overhead. Patrols moved on nearby roads. Yet the column pressed forward, guided by Filipinos who knew every hidden trail. Prisoners wept openly, some looking at the night sky for the first time in 3 years without fear. At dawn on January 31st, exhausted and stretched to breaking, they reached American lines. 513 souls had been saved. The final accounting revealed the scale of what had been accomplished. 513 prisoners freed, 489 Americans, 23 other Allied personnel, and several civilians. 2 Rangers killed, 4 wounded. More than 200 Japanese soldiers dead, their garrison destroyed. But numbers alone couldn't capture the mission's true measure. This was coordination between Rangers who had never built ships, scouts who provided eyes in darkness, guerrillas who held impossible positions, and villagers who risked annihilation. Filipino families had gambled everything to aid the column. For America, survivors' names reaching families who had waited 3 years brought joy and vindication. For Japan, the raid demonstrated that no position was secure. For military history, it remained one of the most successful rescue operations ever attempted. The trap at Cabanatuan had been willingly entered by men who understood that courage, planning, and solidarity could overcome impossible odds. 2 words changed 513 lives forever. You're free. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.